Welcome everyone to the Institute for Public Knowledge. My name is Michael Conswick, Associate Director here at IPK. I want to start off by thanking all of you for being here tonight, despite the weather and temptation to just unwind at home and try to ignore the state of everything. We are incredibly grateful that everyone comes out here for a discussion about serious present-day topics that are highly relevant, like the one we're about to talk about today. Let me briefly introduce tonight's lineup. Our guest author is Irvin Ibargüen. He's, as many in the room may already know, assistant professor of history here at NYU, who focuses on Latino migrations. His book, which you can buy a copy after tonight's event, came out just a few months ago, Caught in Current, Mexico's Struggle to Regulate Emigration, 1940 to 1980. And it examines Mexico's failed attempts to corral migration to the United States when it was still a nascent phenomenon. It highlights migrants' resistance to Mexican strategies of containment, how the U.S. undermined policies to modulate the migratory flow, and the recurrent fragility of Mexico's interventions. A second book in progress is tentatively titled True North, The Hidden History of Central American Migrants in Mexico. His work has received support from the Mexican government's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Harvard Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, Charles Warren Center for Studies of American History, and the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. We're also very grateful to have two guest speakers to comment on Irvin's book. Cristina and Beltran is the first one. Cristina works at the intersection of Latinx politics and political theory. She's an associate professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, just downstairs, and she's the author of Cruelty to Citizenship, How Migrant Suffering Sustains White Democracy, which was published in 2020. And the book, The Trouble with Unity, Latino Politics and the Creation of Identity. From 2019 to 2024, she was the co-editor of the journal Theory and Event, and her next book, which we are all looking forward to, Racial Sensations, Essays on Latinos and the Multiracial Politics of Conservatism, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press. Our last speaker is Natasha Iskander, longtime friend of IPK. She is the James Weldon Johnson Professor of Urban Planning and Public Service at the Wagner School of Public Service. That is where she conducts research on the relationship between migration and economic development. Her first book, Creative State, 40 Years of Migration and Development Policy in Morocco and Mexico, was published in 2010 and looked at the ways that migrant workers transformed the economic development policies of their countries of origin. Her most recent book, Does Skill Make Us Human? Migrant Workers in 21st Century Qatar and Beyond, examines the use of skill categories to define political personhood in ways that have become increasingly salient with the hardening borders and the pressures of climate change. Her current project focuses on concrete as a material lens to examine the relationship between climate change, migration, urbanization, and the future of work. So Natasha and Cristina, thank you for being here. The way things work here is our author, Irvin, will give a presentation, roughly 20 to 30 minutes. Cristina and Natasha will comment on the book. There'll be a brief back and forth, and we'll make sure we'll have 20 to 30 minutes for a Q&A at the end. So please save your comments or your questions for the end. But please welcome Irvin Ibargüen.
So first of all, thank you to IPK, thank you for Mike for having me, thank you to my colleagues for being here, many of my doctoral students, grad students that have been attached, undergrads as well. It kind of feels like, reminds me of my wedding when like a lot of people from different parts of my life that had never met before came together. So it's a little bit like that, but it's a good thing, right? So thanks to you all for coming out to kind of be part of this kind of celebration of the books coming out into the world. I try to kind of structure this talk a little bit more as less as me giving a speech and more as an invitation for you to pick up the book, or if you can't buy it, go to the library, check it out, however you can consume it. So the talk is, as you see here, is kind of titled The Fantasy of Migration Control. Obviously we know about the fantasy of migration control, I think, from the US side. And so a lot of what I'll try to do with my talk today is give you a sense of just how much of a fantasy migration control also is when we look south of the border from a Mexican perspective. But before we get into like the nooks and crannies of the book and the big arguments and that sort of thing, I thought it'd be useful, especially for undergrads, grad students, or just in general, for y'all to get a sense of where the project comes from, where it's born from, because I think that's the only way to honestly get a sense of why the project was important to me, and I decided to spend however many years writing it. So I want to talk about the roots of the project. And as you might imagine, that kid is me. And as you see, I don't need to like overly interpret it for you. I was a very angry kid. I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn. I always had this kind of question growing up, you know. It was, even the 90s, I know the 90s now seem like a relatively welcoming era for immigration. But even then, right, there was a lot of anti-Mexican discourse. And I certainly felt kind of that discourse growing up, right? So I certainly felt a little bit alienated from the country. And so I just had a very basic question, you know, why am I here? Why are we here, right? I think that was a question that I grew up with at kind of the front of my mind. You know, living in the Northeast, there's a lot of knowledge about certain kind of pockets of Latino history, right? So Puerto Ricans, for example, have a well-established kind of lineage in New York City. And so I imagine Puerto Ricans might be able to answer that question better than I could, right? I think living in New York, there wasn't, at the time, quite a bit of knowledge centers around Mexican studies. There are now, for example, at Looming College and that sort of thing. But I didn't really feel like I could find kind of an answer to that question of, you know, why am I here? Why are we here, right? Obviously, as I became an academic, I learned how to make that question more formal and objective. And then basically I turned it into the question of, you know, how do we explain the large presence of Mexicans in the United States, despite the kind of obvious demonization that has often kind of accompanied their migration to their country. And really that question drove me to another question, which is, you know, what does this look like from the perspective of the Global South, right, and statecraft in the Global South? What did these countries do, if anything ever, right, to try to retain their citizens in their country, right? And so a lot of the project really comes forth from that curiosity. And when I began to ask that question of, like, you know, what did these states in the Global South do, in particular Mexico, oftentimes what I found was the argument that essentially these states supported and aided, right, the migration in a very kind of explicit and cynical fashion, right? That they treat migration as a safety valve to the United States, an internal safety valve, sorry. That by letting people go abroad, right, this relieves kind of internal pressures, political pressures, economic pressures, and so on and so forth, right? And so therefore, migration becomes useful in that sense. To the extent that there is any kind of, in the scholarship in particular, any observations about these countries adopting kind of counter-migratory postures, they're frequently seen as bluster, right? Moments in which these kind of nations may be engaged in a little bit of chest thumping to try to say that they can retain their migrants, but it's never seen as anything kind of real substantive, a real direction that these countries might have headed to at one point or another. And so this kind of deeply troubled me, I would say, because I would say these kind of safety valve arguments essentially mirror kind of right-wing arguments about how these third world countries dumped their poor onto the United States, right? And so you know, that sat a little bit uncomfortably with me initially, and so that's when I really tried to begin to pursue this question of, you know, yes, we understand that there's this history of Global South countries extruding migration, these histories of extrusion, but is there a history of retention, right? Might there be a history of retention? Now, this is just a question at this point. I just asking, right? So I decided to go into the archives those of you who don't know me, I'm a historian, and so you know, many of us in the historical discipline spend our time in historical archives, and so you know, I went through a variety of archives in the lead up to this question, right? Including Washington D.C., so the archives in Nara, oral histories with migrants, some state archives in northern Mexico, but really the kind of archive I kept coming back to was the Archivo General de la Nación in Mexico City, because there has housed kind of the federal government's perspective on these matters, right? Really, my question is about federal policy, and therefore this was kind of the natural place where I just kept on coming back multiple times because I kept seeing indications, right, here and there, that there was this kind of simmering story, right, of counter-migratory policymaking in Mexico. It had just kind of gone unnoticed, given how much the literature really focuses on Mexico kind of conducing migrants or releasing migrants abroad. So ultimately I decided to kind of write a project that really centered what I call Mexico's mitigatory migratory policies. And so that's an intentionally kind of a tongue twister, so that people like kind of remember like an annoying term when they read the book. But basically these are policies that are designed to kind of modulate or throttle, right, migration from a sending state, from the traditional sending state to the traditional receiving state. So again, these are policies to kind of keep or retain migrants. And again, I found that Mexico, at various junctures in the history, had slid into this register of policymaking for three reasons in particular. The first is that they saw migration as kind of causing a lot of social chaos, so a lot of movements and this became problematic at different junctures, right? The widespread dispersal of populations on routes to the United States. The second was the kind of the idea that it, or the feeling that it caused a kind of labor drain to specific industries at specific junctures in its history. And the last one, and the most important one, is that it kind of caused reputational damage, right? That the exportation of migrants abroad, or the release of migrants abroad, and their abuse in places like the United States, right, reflected poorly then on the Mexican ruling regime in question, right? And so these three kind of veins of concern are what ended up giving shape to, again, what I call Mexico's mitigatory migratory policies. So ultimately, I conclude that it's not one or another. I'm not trying to convince you that Mexico tried to retain migrants or release migrants, but rather that they kind of flip-flopped, right, throughout the 20th century, that they vacillated on their posture, right, that they engaged in both policies to kind of catalyze migration, but also policies to act as a countervailing force to migration, right, that they kind of had these dual registers and very much so again, if I could express it in an informal way, they really sat on the fence when it came to migration, right, and kind of try to read the prevailing kind of headwinds as they went. So, should come as no surprise that I think these policies failed, right? Otherwise there would be no gigantic Mexican population in the United States, and this would all be moot point. So I just want to give you, before we go into kind of the specific examples of this, I want to first lay out kind of why, my perception of why these policies to kind of modulate migration or stem migration ultimately failed. The first, to look internally at Mexican statecraft and to say Mexican statecraft was excessively kind of non-committal. There was excessive hedging. There's an excessive kind of a wait-and-see approach, right? Especially when it came to things like reputational damage, right? The Mexican state hoped that by making like little changes to the migration, it could somehow better the situation. But all this ended up doing was entrenching the migration, allowing time for the migration to become more and more entrenched. The second thing when it comes to the Mexican state and its attempts to kind of counter migration is that when it does so historically, it does so operating from a place of limited moral authority, right? It oftentimes will try to make an argument to Mexican migrants, right, for staying at home, for the viability of staying at home based upon some imagined political projects, right? But these often ring hollow, right, to Mexican citizens, right? Because they perceive the PRI, the Mexican ruling party, right, as being kind of smoke and mirrors, right? Not exactly kind of being a reliable architect for policy making. The second element that we'll get to in terms of explaining the failure is that we cannot just see this as an internal story, but also need to see kind of the external factors, in particular U.S. policymaking. The U.S. at various junctures, as we'll see in some of the anecdotes, let's say, that I'll take you through. The U.S. is very much aware of some of these kind of counter-migratory moments, but it engages in kind of unilateral policymaking that really ignores Mexican concerns, right? Oftentimes the U.S. will kind of govern this migration, well, just even the fact that I say governs the migration, will essentially act as if only it governs the migration and govern it through fiat, right? With very little kind of input from Mexican authority, right? This ultimately kind of makes Mexican statecraft very reactive. It's oftentimes reacting after the fact to U.S. policies that are made with no consultation or very limited consultation with Mexican federal leaders. And the last kind of factor that I would throw in here in terms of understanding the failure of these policies is the reality of how migrants process these policies to keep them at home, right? Oftentimes, what Mexico would sell them as kind of an opportunity to stay at home, they would often read more as a constraint on their mobility, right? A constraint on their freedom. They would perceive Mexico more as an interloper, right? In this kind of relationship that they have between themselves and American businesses than as a kind of force that will kind of help them out in any kind of way. So what I'll do for the rest of the talk is take you through three kind of concrete vignettes or windows to show you kind of how these migratory policies kind of came about and how they ultimately fell apart. All right, so I pick up the story in the Bracero era. The Bracero era is, for those of you unfamiliar with the Bracero period, during World War II, the United States and Mexico agreed for a guest worker agreement to bring over Mexican migrants and work in a variety of mostly kind of agricultural harvest, in the agricultural harvest in the United States. Mexico was hesitant to agree to this agreement, and in fact dragged its feet for about a year or two before it actually agreed and consented to send migratory laborers to the United States. But it ultimately agreed and consented to this agreement because it thought, particularly the administration of Manuel Ávila Camacho, presumed that Mexico could pull back when needed, right? They presumed, right, that this was an experiment, right, that they could kind of actively negotiate the variables of this experiment as they went along. And so for that reason, they kind of assented, even though there was trepidation in particular, because in the period right before World War II, the U.S. had just deported about 400,000 Mexicans or Mexican Americans from the United States, right? And so this loomed large over U.S.-Mexican relationships and the particular ask that the U.S. makes in 1942. So when the U.S. comes asking for Mexican migrants to supplement American soldiers who have gone to the war front, Mexico is very reticent, given, right, the abuses that had taken place, particularly in the early half of the 1930s. I should also add that the modulation, this element of modulated migration, is embedded into the Bracero Agreement, this guest worker agreement, because Mexico, for example, attempts to correlate its participation, the participation of municipalities based upon the unemployment rate in those municipalities, right? So it's not necessarily framed as a free-for-all in Mexico, right? There's this idea that we will let migrants go insofar as it relieves kind of internal economic problems, but not beyond that, any measure beyond that. I want to just some pictures here, because I guess part of what I want to emphasize is just how much excitement there was around the Bracero program in this country. I think I'm always surprised when I do my Latino history classes, right, and like nobody knows about the Bracero program. But in the 1940s, actually, this was a widely celebrated program, right? These migrant workers were received openly in the United States and were understood as people who would be not just lifting or harvesting crops, but actually contributing to the fight against fascism, right? Against Hitler and Nazi Germany and Mussolini and so on and so forth. And so when they come to the United States, especially in that first year, 1942, there's often kind of public parades and festivals where people go into the streets to welcome these migrants. Even places like the American Legion, right, which are very kind of nationalistic, right, hold parties, right, to like welcome these migrants to the United States. And again, the framework is very much one of kind of excitement, right, for this migration that's being catalyzed in this particular moment. You know, the book really emphasizes more so the how we move from this kind of rah-rah of the 1940s to a much more downcast version of what migratory labor really is like as this program matures. The program is really sold as this kind of like historic hallmark in terms of labor protections. And by and large, actually, historians agree, right, that the program has embedded in it, right, historic protections and safeguards around things, basic things such as wages and housing, nutrition, and so forth. But as Mexico will learn, these paper promises often meant very little without enforcement mechanisms. And so the migrants themselves would often complain, right, that a lot of the kind of the standards that are included in the Bracero program were not up to par and caused them suffering. But really the person that helps to really dismantle the rah-rah vision of the Bracero program is a scholar activist by the name of Natasha, who is, interestingly enough, actually a Mexican migrant himself, but he arrives to the United States and is able to move up in American society and obtains a doctorate in history from Columbia University. And after he graduates, instead of going kind of the academic route for a little bit, he actually dedicates his life to labor activism. And so part of what this involves is going into some of these Bracero camps himself sometimes, or obtaining informants, and figuring out what life actually is like, right, for Mexican migrants, beyond the rah-rah framing, beyond this idea that these are the kind of historic protections for these migrant workers. And he goes a step further than this, right? He not only obtains these reports, but he seeds these reports to newspapers on both sides of the border, right? So he actively gets both American media and Mexican media to begin to cover the migration from multiple angles. And again, there's no necessarily one devastating story. What's effective about his approach to the scholar activism in this period is his critiques rain down like a pitter-patter on the migration. It hits him from every angle, right? So there's like articles about how migrants are kept in chicken coops instead of actually like given beds and that sort of thing. How some migrants are given dog food, right, instead of like the supposed baseline provisions. And so really what this kind of coverage helps to do is provoke the question for Mexico, for Mexican society and Mexican government, is the Bracero program, is guest work the right way to govern a migration? Right? Is this the correct way of doing things? Right? That's ultimately kind of where he heads us. This is just an example of a headline in Mexico from I think 1952, 1953. And so you can read there, vale más la vida de un animal que de un bracero, right? So the life of an animal is worth more than that of a bracero in the United States. So we're clearly kind of far away by 1952, really far away from this kind of incipient moment of celebration of migration, and are much more seeing even the media itself, right, covering this as a kind of lamentable phenomenon. We also begins to seed a shift in popular culture as well in Mexico. There are movies, this is the most prominent of which, Espaldas Mojadas, which is made in 1953, that essentially depict migration as a emasculating phenomenon, right? And you kind of get that here, right, by the kind of the broad musculature of the back of this migrant. And so the plot itself relates to a migrant who was exploited by a particular wealthy landowner in California, but ultimately gets his payback in the movie. And the movie itself will go on to win multiple awards in Mexico. But the Mexican state, interestingly, sees this movie as being threatening, right, and moves to actually delay its release as long as it can, because it thinks these kind of narratives are really cutting against the kind of the rah-rah narrative it had kind of promulgated initially with the migration. This even get this again. I think it's important that we move from just this kind of these critiques in newspapers to popular culture, because a lot of times people don't read the paper, but they'll take in the music. And you know, one of the things I found interesting doing the research here was seeing like little artifacts like this. This is a song by Pedro Infante, which is released in 1953. For those of you who are not familiar with Pedro Infante, one of the most iconic singers, probably the most iconic singer of this period in Mexican society. He releases this song in 1953, and it mainly deals with retelling the story of migration in a kind of very downcast term. I just want to play you a little snippet of the song for a second. So it's like a 3-minute song, but I'm just going to play like 30 seconds. That's the lyrics of it.
Arizona y Texas y por Luciana, siempre sentí la falta de estimación, que es que dicen que es discriminación. Ay, qué triste es la vida, qué triste vida es la del bracero. Ay, cuánta decepción, cuánta desolación.
All right, so you get the sense. Very sad, melancholy music. You could drink a beer too, that kind of thing. So obviously, from the Mexican perspective, right, this is very problematic, right? Because the kind of the edifice they have put up for the kind of the celebratory migration is really kind of falling on its face by 1953, 1954, and this coincides with the fact that the Bracero program is set to lapse in January 1954. Obviously, now we kind of narrate the Bracero program as if it was one monolithic thing. But it's, of course, a kind of a series of bilateral treaties, right, that have to be renewed and, in theory, by consent, right, agreed to mutually by these sides. So what Mexico decides to do in January 1954 is to let the Bracero program lapse, right, let it kind of run its course. Their idea being that perhaps this kind of governing framework for the migration just does not work, right. In particular, what kind of brings Mexico to this decision, in particular the administration of Dr. Cortines, is that he is not able to secure from the United States a kind of guarantee that that Mexico can unilaterally blacklist employees. Mexico wants the power to unilaterally blacklist any employer who commits labor violations against migrants. Right? Mexico feels this is important because this, in their eyes, would be to actually retain true sovereignty and control over their migrant population. Right? Instead, what the U.S. prefers to do is to have bilateral blacklisting procedures, right, where both parties have to engage in like prolonged investigations of a particular employer, and then by the time they figure it out, it's like too gray and nothing ever happens, right? So Mexico kind of wisens up to that situation and basically says there will be no Bracero program if there is no unilateral blacklisting power, no true sovereignty for us in this situation. So in addition to kind of pulling out of their agreement, they decide to close the border gates at key border crossings along northern Mexico to prevent Mexicans from leaving against its kind of dictate that there would be no further migration at this moment, pending further news. And again, so it's very interesting at a time in which we usually think about the U.S. closing the border, right? Mexico is the one here really moving to secure this perimeter. In particular, the great amount the focus ends up in January 1954 ends up zeroing in on the town of city town of Mexicali, Baja California, that picture there with the red star. The main reason being that many migrant workers at the time, in January 1954, are headed to the Imperial Valley in Southern California to pick up the lettuce crop, and so that is where the kind of migratory stream is headed at that particular moment. that Mexico decides to kind of close the border gates. This is a view of the Imperial Valley in California, kind of that classic, right, rectangular grid production, American capitalist production. What I think is important in the book is the kind of the argument that I was able to kind of put together by looking at kind of the Mexican side of the story, the Mexican archives, is that this is very much not treated as an international treaty and dispute between two diplomatic corps, right? This is very much processed by both Mexican government elites and observers as a moment, as kind of an internal referendum, right? The way I kind of depicted in the book is, or what I call it, is that this is depicted as kind of a sovereign pause on migration, a moment to finally reflect on this process that Mexico had decided to engage in beginning in 1942. And so, part of what I found in the archives was just like the government was flooded with like letters and letters and letters from different sectors of Mexican society, labor unions, peasant associations, business associations, right? Each of which saw this moment not as an opportunity to renegotiate a Presero agreement with better terms, but as an opportunity to fix ailments that they believed they perceived in Mexican society from their perspective, right? And so that is ultimately kind of what kind of really struck me the most about this moment, is the way in which various actors believed this was a moment that kind of opened the key for internal reform within Mexico in a kind of very optimistic way. This is just one example of this. So one of the things I found in the archive was a white paper that was circulated within the administration about creating a new agency within the Mexican government that would essentially take migrants and place them in kind of colonial colonized settlements for colonization throughout Mexico, and these would be supported by the Mexican government. And they came up with the whole thing, like the point system, and like which migrants they would give preference to, like depending on whether they were married and what income they had going into this. And so what stood out to me, even beyond the fact that there was a proposal to create this kind of colonization scheme, was just how openly the Mexican government acknowledged in this moment the root causes, that migration is really rooted in economic causes. So I believe this is page 2 or 3 of the document, says, the agency will try to combat in a gradual manner the emigration of agricultural workers, tackling the resolution of economic causes which engender such migrations, right? So the Mexican state is very forthrightly placing, is acknowledging, right, that economics are the kind of the driving mechanism behind migration, and that's what needs to be kind of addressed if the migration is ever going to get, it's ever going to be abated by Mexican policy. And second to that, I would say also, migration often becomes the mechanism through which the Mexican state kind of links itself to its kind of post-revolutionary tradition, right? To this kind of idea that land reform would be the way of rooting people domestically. Now, Mexico will frame its stoppage of migrants at the border as being kind of protectionist, right? This is a moment of protectionism in Mexican history. The migrants perceive this entirely as a coercive crackdown, right? Today they don't buy any of this kind of these white papers and any of these speeches that are being delivered by the Mexican government. They are being held back. The logic that's being given to them on the ground as to why they can't leave is that the Mexican government says that if they leave, they will produce so many claims of discrimination that Mexican consulates will be overwhelmed, right? And they won't be able to actually help them, right? So that's kind of what they're being told. These are people who, by this point, are oftentimes rather short on money. They only come with a certain amount of money to make it to the border, with a certain understanding that after a certain amount of time they'll be contracted out to the United States. So monetarily, they're kind of struggling in this particular moment, and they also kind of seem to lack, from oral histories that I was able to listen to, seem to fundamentally lack faith in any immigration officers, period, right? They understand them as being corrupt people. They don't understand them as being people who will somehow set them on the path to a future kind of sedentary life within Mexico. They see them as people who you can buy off for $1, right, and make your way to the United States, right? And so really for them, in this moment, while Mexico is saying that the power lies in their policy making, policy reforms, the migrants believe that their power lies in their mobility, right? And this is a mobility they have, that they have to kind of move between crops and wages and bosses and that sort of thing. And that's what's being kind of fundamentally kind of cracked down in this moment. Interestingly, Mexico recognizes its kind of crisis of legitimacy in this moment. So it brings in Governor Braulio Maldonado of Baja California. Governor Braulio Maldonado would have a little bit more legitimacy in making these kind of arguments. He was himself a migrant to the United States when he was young. He returned to Mexico and he became a politician, in part by writing this biography where he talks about his migratory experience. And in the 1940s in Baja California, he engaged in some projects to provide migrants with land for settlements there, right? So the Mexican state strategically sends Bradley Maldonado to the front lines, right, to make the argument that no, seriously, this is a unique moment in Mexican history. Please believe us, don't go away, and that sort of thing. Ultimately, not too many people buy into it. Literally, the only people that I found in the archives that bought into the rhetoric that Mexico can place you internally were this group of people here, which I haven't even bothered to count because it was like 30, 40 people basically agreed to move to a settlement in La Paz in Baja California. They're intentionally placed along kind of a sea area. The idea being that in the meantime, while the settlement is established, they'll be able to kind of fish and bathe themselves there and that sort of thing. So even while the Mexican state is setting them up, supposedly setting them up, right, it's also kind of saying you're on your own for the first bits, and then we'll come in later. Away from the border, and I talk a little bit about this in the book. So the emphasis is not only on these migrants here that are pictured at the border, but a lot of Mexican statecraft in the moment is about preventing more people from coming to the border in this moment. And so this is where we see, and I detail this in the book, throughout Mexico there's this formation of these kind of citizen brigades where they go kind of knocking door to door with prominent individuals of a particular town, like priests and that sort of thing, trying to convince people to like stay in their homeland, right? It's a special moment for national history, for national history. There are meetings of organizations like the CNSA, and I won't bore you with all these kind of details. But basically, there is kind of a mobilization, right, internally to kind of keep not just the people at the border pacified, but people also from leaving their particular towns and kind of joining this ongoing wave at the border. The kind of the height of this is the president at the time, President Adolfo Cortines, goes on a kind of begins to kind of articulate this idea of his vision of Mexicans for Mexico, right? Kind of like MAGA in reverse, right? Now, this kind of nationalization of the migrant internally. But again, this is very much at the level of discourse. There are these kind of gestating plans internally. They haven't been mobilized yet at the moment. There are these kind of small plans to relocate people, but none of it kind of seems to be picking up steam. And it's in this context that the United States really gets kind of fed up with this little experiment that Mexico is engaging with, right? That basically, the Department of Labor writes a long internal report and says, we're not really sure what the Mexicans are up to right now, but what we do know is that the lettuce crop is rotting, right? And that we need Mexicans in the field, right? And so the Department of Labor decides to essentially jettison Mexico as a partner in managing migration and declares that any Mexican able and willing to come to the United States is welcome to do so, right? That there is a, functionally speaking, an open border, right, for any Mexican who can, as long as you can show up there, right, you will be welcomed into the United States of America. Now, as you might imagine, this provokes quite a bit of hysterics in Mexico. All the front pages talk about like a migrant apocalypse and Armageddon, right? That every Mexican is going to leave, right? Given this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, right, to abandon their homeland and go to the United States. This kind of incredible border laxity that the United States is announcing in this moment. Now, ultimately, so this is all going to be taking place in a couple of weeks in January, right? So this is all going very kind of fast. Ultimately, the problem doesn't end up being the numbers of people who arrive to the border, but the intensity of the people who are at the border, right? Because once they find out, right, that there is this kind of laxity on the U.S. side, they immediately want to begin crossing over into the United States, right? And this is where we begin to see the outbreak for a couple of days of full-on skirmishes between migrants and the Mexican military, right? Because the Mexican military is under direction to keep them within Mexico, and the migrants are with the mind that it's time to unleash our mobility, right? Make our way into the United States and take advantage of this open border and go pick the lettuce crop. There are these skirmishes. Ultimately, a couple of people are injured and one is killed as a result of these skirmishes that take place at the border. And Mexico decides at this moment the administration of Adolfo Cortines decides to desist from this experiment, right? They said this is kind of a bad idea. It doesn't seem like we have a good hold, right, on this migrant population. And so essentially the Mexican military is pulled out and they move out of the way. And Mexican migrants are able now to make good on the Department of Labor's promise of an open border, right? So this is what happens in late January 1954. Mexican migrants crossing their way undeterred by the Mexican government and unpoliced by the Border Patrol on the American side. And you can just compare their faces to like how pissed they were when here, right? Again, you just read their faces, you can get a sense like these are not people. They were not taking what they had taken as an offense, as a constraint, was Mexican intervention rather than American policymaking. So this plays into, interesting, this leads to like this also gives us insight actually into the fantasy of immigration control from the US side. Because ultimately the US realizes that this is a terrible idea for them too. Right? Because they're actually, they declare the open border and they want to pluck out like a couple hundred migrants every day in a kind of systematic fashion. But what they find is that because they've already announced this open border, these migrants are not obeying at all, right? And they kind of continue to kind of throw themselves as a group, right, to try to move past the Border Patrol in this moment. And this feeds the narrative then that immigration is out of control in America, right? That the Border Patrol doesn't have a firm grasp on things. And so this is how the United States ends up agreeing to Mexico's proposal to just put all this bad blood behind them, right, and instead return to the Bracero program framework, right, because that would be more orderly. And this is just a picture, like, I think this was entirely staged, but this is what remains in Mexicali after this border incident, right? Some nicely placed ponchos and some burros. Check on it on time. So maybe I'll just take you through one more thing. I didn't realize I was dragging on for that long. I apologize. So I'll just tell you about the kind of the second innovation, or the second migratory policy that I cover in the book for about 2 chapters. Because after 1954, Mexico doesn't give up on using migrant labor internally or attempting to use migrants internally. Yes, it's seen as a kind of an embarrassing moment, but a lot of this is kind of deflected by seeding the idea that it was the migrants' fault, that the migrants chose not to be patriotic in this moment. So after 1954, with the Bracero program still in place, what Mexico attempts to do is at least make sure that a trickle of this migrant labor will operate internally, right? And so they come up with a program to exploit migrant labor internally before it ever makes its way to the United States, right? Mainly the idea here, the way they're able to pitch this to migrants, is that if they work for 15 days in picking cotton in northern Mexico, or achieve about 20,000 kilos of cotton, they will be given expedited shipment to the United States, right? Now this sounds like a labor program, but really what it is a kind of attempt to wield or sell certainty to migrants, right? A lot of what from migrant perspective, what had been the problem with the Bracero program is that it was very unclear when they would be contracted, right? They often had to wait for like the U.S. to kind of send over, word about how many migrants they wanted, and so it was very difficult to kind of figure out your place in the queue, right? What this program offered was the idea that if you worked for northern Mexican cotton producers, you would be given kind of a heads up in advance along the line, and so that's kind of the premise of the program. Its main architect is Governor Obregón Tapia of the state of Sonora, who is obviously kind of intimately connected to the kind of upper echelons of pre-governance or Mexican governance. His father was Mexican president of Mexico in 1920, and so he is governor here in the 1950s. And his family, in addition to having political power, has economic power. They have own a lot of cotton fields, and so it's through that connection, right, that they're able to kind of engineer and kind of pull the lever of Mexican national policy and create this program to have migrants pick cotton internally within Mexico. Now there's just to keep it brief, 3 big problems with this program. The first is that Mexico doesn't actually control the certainty of anything, right? They can certainly bring these migrants to labor in cotton fields in northern Mexico, but they can't actually promise them when the U.S. is going to be able to admit them, right? And so this becomes a huge source of aggravation for migrants, right? Because they will often render their services in northern Mexico, only to find that actually there is no real mechanism for being expeditedly shipped to the United States. The second element of this is that it becomes immediately plagued with corruption. So there are these spots to be sold for expedited shipment to the United States, but those end up being given to not to those who worked in the cotton crop, but those who pay an additional fee, right? So the migrants end up observing that we just labored in the fields, but the ones who are actually sent to the United States are those who pay an additional payment to immigration authorities in Mexico. And the last part of it is that these migrants are frequently bought in for what they call the culeo, right, which is the last stage of the cotton picking. This is the part where this is like the third round of picking the cotton. So by this time, it's actually really hard to get any kind of cotton from the stalk. And so to try to meet the threshold of 20,000 kilos is actually kind of hard, right? And so they experience this program as a kind of cynical program that offers a kind of this false door to the United States rather than any kind of serious passage. And so this is just some pictures of how these people are managed, how the migrants are managed in northern Mexico by this internal labor exploitation regime. And what I kind of really focus on in the book, is the way in which the migrants themselves end up being the kind of the pivotal political actors, right, in undermining this program, right? They, unlike in the United States where they often show up as undocumented workers and guest workers and with limited political rights, in Mexico, they feel themselves to be fully empowered as citizens, right? And so they will often, for example, sit outside the office of like a municipal governor or that sort of thing, municipal authorities, to try to make claims about corruption, right? To try to root out corruption within Mexico. In particular, they end up singling out this guy as being, in 1961, as being the leader of this bribery scheme, right? That instead of offering these contracts to the United States on the basis of work rendered, to instead offer those contracts, right, via payments. Interestingly, the corruption never goes away, and this ends up being kind of a massive headache for the Mexican government. They keep on sending agents from their ministry, the Secretaría de Gobernación, to try to oversee a lot of this contracting. And they find that while they're there, everybody behaves well, and the second they pull out, the corruption picks up again, and the migrants are complaining again, and there's a lot of kind of friction within the program. The migrants themselves basically continue their kind of lobbying campaign. I think the pointed question that they asked in this moment that I found in the archives was, are we even braceros or not, right? Like, what are these things that you were doing? What are these programs that you're putting in place? It seems to us to be, in their words, a racket, right, a lie. And so ultimately, this program ends up being undone in 1961, wound down in 1961. It's granted like a 2-year extension for a couple of regions within northern Mexico, but it's ultimately wound down on the basis of their political activism in their moment. So I have a bunch of other stuff, but evidently I should wind this down. So the last thing I'll say, just by way of conclusion, so the book goes into other areas. It takes us into the 70s, 80s, and 90s to look at other moments of Mexican counter-migratory policymaking. In particular, the 70s and 80s, the Mexican government really begins to argue that what the U.S. and Mexico need is to create a collaborative wall of progress. By this point, the Pesaro program kind of comes to an end. We see a kind of a rise of undocumented immigration to the United States, and a rise of a lot of abuses, especially by the Border Patrol. Because what the guest worker program had done, at least had kind of provided a secure framework for travel, right? With that gone, right, the Border Patrol, this border crossing becomes a huge problem in Mexican politics. And so we see Mexican politicians in the 70s really argue for this idea of a wall of progress, right? And the whole premise is actually to reduce tariffs on Mexico. And the good thing I don't have to educate you on tariffs, because that's all we talk about nowadays. For me, the central lesson of the book is that these states are good at, states such as Mexico are good at when it comes to activating migration, are really poor at kind of throttling or disactivating that migration. The way I phrase this for myself kind of casually is they're great at mothering migration, they're terrible at smothering migration, right? And so ultimately, I think what the book shows us is kind of how I think just as the U.S. has these kind of cycles of post-war of nativism and protectionism to kind of restrict migration, we see those same cycles play out in Mexico, right? Just kind of framed around nationalism and protection of certain kind of industries in Mexico. But just as those kind of cycles tend to fail in the United States, they also tend to fail on Mexico's side. And I think now we're living kind of in the political wreckage, right, of the kind of hubris of the states of thinking that they can activate this migratory flow when they didn't really have a good grip on the situation. And so that therefore the title, Caught in the Currents, is what I kind of lead with. All right, so I apologize for taking so much time.
It was great. Thank you so much. Well, I'm very quick. I'll be very brief because I just want to be in conversation with this fantastic book. So thank you all for being here, and congratulations on this beautiful book. It's really exciting. Reading this, I was like, I cannot wait to teach this next, in the fall, because I think it really does some really important things, especially because I think it's a gift to not only the field of history, Latin American studies, Latinx studies, migration studies. It's just doing so much work in fields that overlap and relate, comparative politics. So just a really necessary book. I want to just speak about a few thoughts that the book raised for me, primarily as a political theorist and Latinx studies scholar, that points of conversation we might have. I think one of the things that's so interesting is the way the book breaks with some of the as Irvin was saying, some of the conventional accounts of the history of U.S.-Mexico relations and this kind of classic language of a safety valve, right? And I think, that alone, I think, makes it a really important intervention, that it breaks from that kind of simplistic narrative and really looks, and I think too often, and I think of this for myself as an Americanist primarily in my own training, is that we talk about migration as a problem for receiving countries. And we don't think nearly enough about the local and internal politics of sending countries, and the fact that a sending country can also be a country trying to stop migration, right? Trying to limit the movement of people. And so I don't think we think enough about the costs of losing population, the cost of those sending communities, and so this book does, like, I think, really critical work there. Right, that this is a story, sometimes Irvin's describing a story of labor shortages in Mexico, right? Not just a story of like excess labor that needs somewhere to go, but sites in which there's shortages and folks are struggling to figure out how to get work and get workers. I think one thing that the issue that really struck me in this book was Irvin's point that rather than hew to one specific, well-defined approach, Mexico's migration policy was characterized, as he puts it, by continuing adaptation throughout the 20th century, including how he describes it as ambiguous and waffling behavior. Mexican leaders, as he puts it, constantly hedged their bets, right? They craved the benefits of outmigration, yet they wanted to be able to modulate and impede that movement altogether, if and when its downsides became untenable. And this sort of shifting back and forth, he notes, is a quality of a lot of sending states, right? In the one sense restricting, and then the next sense encouraging, and the kind of back and forth. And I think the thing that I just am curious of talking about is the ongoing sense of how reactive migration policy is. Like that it's just always, it's always not only kind of a backward looking, you always feel like it's fighting the past war, right? But it's always the fact that political and economic elites want contradictory things. They shift back and forth that have reason often to do with their political ambition, their own political survival, the survival of their political parties. And so there's a fluidity that is just so reactive. And I would just love to talk about that quality of, as he put, they lacked timeliness, right? And again, each time they went against the current, they tried to contain outmigration. And he describes this in the way that their actions are not so much experimental, but frenzied. And I just wanted to read this passage because I think this sounds like the Biden administration to me. I'm just going to read this quote that Irvin writes. He writes, their policymaking was sloppily experimental, guided by a desire to do anything to deal with emergent migratory crises. Born of such haste, their counter-migratory intervention suffered from underdeveloped plans for implementation, oversight, and funding. Moreover, Mexican officials lacked commitment to their spur-of-the-moment ideas. They understood they were merely guessing at how to contain the migration. So when their counter-migratory ploys faced complications, they backed away from them instead of pursuing them to their full potential, unquote. So I just think this sounds like so many administrations. You really get the feel for these dynamics that I think we continually contend with. And again, I think it just strikes me again and again is how little our migration policies have to do with the goal of producing thoughtful policy about how to manage the movement of people across, how to think about the management and mobility of people across borders and nation states. The other thing that struck me in the book is the political elite's fantasy of mastery, right? That they could control migration, that they could treat it like a spigot, that they had the power to turn on and off as they saw fit, right? And it turns out, of course, that there are all these not only economic forces, but these agentic forces, and one of the most agentic being migrants themselves. And to me, I'm probably going to just stop here, I think, but I think that to me is one of the richest and most important aspects of Irvin's book, is that talking about when Mexico rolls out its policies to slow and or halt migration, it receives this enormous pushback, as Irvin discussed, from migrants themselves, right? As he put it, they rebuffed Mexico's efforts to impede their mobility. And I think what the book really beautifully speaks to is the fact that migrants, like all of us, are agentic and desirous, right? They desire money, they desire leisure, they desire mobility, they desire freedom, right? They're not just victims, they're not just labor. Even the term bracero, arms, right? They're not just arms, they're human beings who are agents and actors who want to shape their relationship to the states that they inhabit, right? And so I think the importance of doing the kind of history that treats people as not just objects of analysis, but as agents, is a really just a critical element of this book. And the fact that you see different and overlapping desires. You see the desires of government and growers, the desire for cheap labor, the fact that the Bracero program, as folks like May and I have written about, it was already designed to be a program to exploit people. It was a program designed and premised on exploitability, that then the Mexican state is trying to limit and to some extent, try to not have it become that. But of course, that's the story, and so the disavowal of that and the kind of ongoing debates that emerge from that. And the other last point that I had, like one last point and then a couple of questions, was that one was it's a fascinating read about how the open border policy the U.S. introduces in this moment in the 50s is for those of us who live in this moment, it's a fascinating story. But the other part that really struck me was the fact that migrants are denigrated in Mexico as well. In Mexico, there are a population that are denigrated, that there's anti-migrant sentiment that circulates, that there are sensationalist accounts of migrants being put forward, as well as also like the song, the Pedro Infante, like, yeah, he's still my grandma's favorite person. But like the sort of stories of those kinds of songs that are also like, if you know music from like Los Tigres del Norte and other groups that are telling the stories of migrants, like there's a lot of different kind of cultural projects circulating in that moment. Some very sympathetic, but also the fact that there's a story there about how a state, how the government, how the poor, how the working poor who are seeking mobility, seeking justice, seeking movement, how they're being portrayed by both nation states, right? And the violence that they're willing to impose on those populations. The question I had in thinking about this question of, Irvin writes really wonderfully about the question of incentives and repression that the Mexican state engages in. And it made me, and one of the points he makes about the PRI and the fact that this is, he names it as an authoritarian, the authoritarian political dynamics in Mexico, I think is how you describe it. And their political assumptions as a regime that has these sort of authoritarian impulses in it. I guess I wanted to ask about how were those authoritarian dynamics different than more democratic regimes? And so I guess I wanted to think about, or think with you a little bit about, what does it mean to think about how an authoritarian regime approaches migration? Is that different than how a democratic regime approaches migration? Or is there an element of authoritarianism that overreaches when it comes to thinking about the movement of migrants? And is there an authoritarian logic that starts to emerge when we deal with these particular populations? It's just something I'm thinking about. But it's an enormous contribution. I just thank you so much. So thanks.
I had to write down my thoughts because I was so worried that I would get so excited talking about this book that I wouldn't be able to control myself and I would just go on and on about how fabulous it was. So you'll have to forgive me, but I wanted to get to two things that I thought were especially important and two questions. So first, Caught in the Current is an amazing book. It's an invaluable corrective. It challenges the view deeply rooted in both the US and Mexican scholarly literature on migration policy. So not just public literature, but scholarly literature, that the Mexican state was somewhere between a powerless bystander and a willing collaborator with the US and its immigration policy toward Mexico. Irvin shows us instead that the Mexican government has always tried to step in and shape migration. At different times, under different regimes, and in response to different and substantial pressures from the US, the Mexican government consistently deployed policies designed to capture whatever benefits it viewed could be wrung out of migration at any given time, and to curtail whatever negative effects the government was held responsible for. And it continues to do just that today. To reveal the political calculus and the policymaking dynamics, the messiness that Cristina talked about, Irvin hones in on the period between 1940 and 1980, particularly turbulent and contentious and fraught period of migration, when migratory movements between Mexico and the US were governed and shaped both directly and indirectly by the Bracero program, which we heard a lot about this evening. Through his careful documentation of the policy experimentation and political claims that drove the Mexican government's often interventionist approach to migration, and through his brilliant, cogent, and unique analysis of the ways and the reason those government strategies shifted over time, Irvin makes clear that the image of migration as some timeless dynamic created by economistic and faceless push-pull factors, all of you will have heard about push-pull factors ad nauseum, the migration studies version of the invisible hand, right, is not true and has never been true. Instead, migration, like all social phenomena, is tangled up with policy and structured in ways that are often contradictory and indirect by both sending and receiving country governments. Okay, there's so much to love about this book, including the fact that it is a great read, right? Like, you cannot put it down. And it presents material that's newly documented, such as the fantastic discussion of the internal Bracero program. That was just amazing. Through which Mexican growers capitalized on the flow of campesinos seeking to cross over into the US. But I want to focus here on the two things that I said that I especially thought were amazing. So first, Irvin shows us that the Mexican government was actually never really responding to migration. It's important to note that even at its height, the Bracero program, the focal point of both US and Mexican policy context, represented only a fraction of all migration, Mexican migration to the US. Rather, the Mexican government was responding at the various moments chronicled in this book to the valence of migration, most specifically to the political and cultural representation of migrants and their treatment in the US. With rich detail, he shows the influence that movies, press accounts, and testimonials had on the Mexican government's policy process. He shows us that these representations were especially powerful, volatile, and perilous when they cut against the political narratives that the government spun to consolidate its own political legitimacy. So patriotic questions around sovereignty, the strength of the government's commitment to its revolution, the peasant classes it was meant to uplift, and so on. He shows us that the policies that the government launched to manage migration, and especially those designed to curtail it, were on some level equally representational, designed to co-opt and recapture the narrative around migration. And you know, he offers us these amazing accounts of this kind of political education and propaganda efforts to discourage people from migrating to the US, you know, outreach programs, you know, it's like super fascinating. Second, what I found hugely important in this book was its attention to the way that the Mexican government struggled both internally and against US pressure to position migration in the frame of its national economic development project. From its rural development programs to support ejidatarios and its responsiveness to the call of growers in Mexico's north, from its push for import substitution and industrialization, and the geographic micromanagement of labor flows through the internal Bracero program to supercharge ISI, to its desperate negotiations with the US at the end of the Bracero program, and in the decade after its conclusion for investment and tariff reductions to promote industrial development at the border. These factories and industrial production that were supposed to mop the people up who had migrated north to try and cross over the border. The Mexican government tried over and over again to shoehorn migration into its economic planning, but in the end, the direction was flipped. Its attempt to manage migration drove its economic policy, and that is such an important insight. It's really fantastic. So I read Caught in the Current last week when I was in the north of Mexico, where I've been returning for the last 20 years. First, as part of my own work, looking at the way that the Mexican policies to capture remittances created an opening for migrant communities and their constituencies to reshape the Mexican government's approach to economic development. And now, as an observer of the amazing industrial boom there, accelerated over the past 10 years by the push for nearshoring, but seeded by the policy move that Irvin describes in his book. And everyone is producing in the north of Mexico. I mean, everyone. Oreos to aerospace. And the area is now facing acute labor shortages. And what that means is that the Mexican government is now engaged in a new kind of migratory policy, which is, so it's pursuing restrictionist migration policy and border control moves to placate the Trump administration in this very delicate dance that Claudia's doing. But also, by the same token, it's creating a pool of migrant labor at the northern border. Haitians, Venezuelans, Central Americans, Cuban, you name it, you know, Indians, Afghanis, they're all there working in the north of Mexico that northern factories can draw on. So here's my first question, based on this week in Monterrey. What if Mexico is no longer caught in the current? What if it's learned to ride the current? And what if actually, you know, like, was it really ever caught in the current? Right, like, is there a way in which it kind of learned how to surf it? And the second question is, it's more of a methodological question, but it's a super important one to my mind, at least for me in my thinking about this. The book is based on such rich material from Mexico. It provides a window onto the contest, the twists and the turns, the calculations of the Mexican political class. I wonder what the research revealed to you about what the U.S. political class at that time, and possibly still today, was unable to see. Like, what did it miss in its negotiations? Especially in terms of its own policies. Like, you know, who did they think they were dealing with, and how does that differ from who they were really dealing with? And what does that help us understand about what U.S. policymakers fail to see today?
Thank you. Those are great questions. You know, when you write a book, I think you never know who's going to pick it up, and so it's great to know that at least 2 people have read it front to back. Otherwise, you couldn't deliver those kinds of notes on the project. So thank you so much for engaging with the project. So I'll try to answer some of these questions to the best of my abilities, and then hopefully, if you guys have any questions, I can also address those. I guess at first I wanted to return to Cristina's point about just how sloppy Mexican policy making was, because I think that was, for me, that was the thing that kept fascinating me about the project every time I returned to the archive. Because, you know, I was like a 20-year-old, and I go in thinking, like, you know, these statesmen know what they're doing, right? Like, surely they're, like, elaborating their ideas based upon, like, social scientific research. And then you go in there and you find out that, no, that's not how this thing works. They're just, like I said in the book, they're just literally guessing how, and so that's what stood out to me the most, is when I, like, because I mentioned in how 1954 propitiates all this kind of outpouring of correspondence, right, to the government. The thing that stood out to me the most was that the government, somebody was reading this stuff, and somebody was making notes as to, like, oh, that's a good idea, and as like, you know, and like for like, and be like, oh, you know, so and so should have a look at this, right? They were crowdsourcing their migratory policy, right? In the moment, and I thought that was so fascinating, right? That this what in the literature is presented as this kind of very supple, authoritarian, capable state. This is how they build government. And so I thought that was fascinating, right? Then in terms of the agency of the migrants, I think that's another element that kept drawing me back into the book. Because obviously, as I mentioned, where the project originated was this idea of, you know, did the Mexican state ever try to retain these migrants, right? Was this ever this moment of, like, outreach, let's say, right, to migrants? And I was struck when I first started doing the research how vehemently the migrants rejected that outreach, right? Because that didn't map onto, like, my preconceived notions of how that would go down, right? I thought it would be more like 50-50. I didn't think there would only be 20 people lining up to go to, like, La Paz, Baja, that picture I showed you of the migrants resettled in Baja California. So I think it shows us how the migrants, you know, operate with their agency and do so in ways that maybe cut against, for example, my expectations as a researcher, that maybe nationalistic sentiment, for example, might have been an important gravitational, like, pull, keeping them in the homeland, even in spite of these kind of policies being kind of haphazard. But evidently they were able to see past the smoke and mirrors, right? They were able to see, no, this is all these kind of things the state is saying they will offer us, you know, are not as important to us as the immediacy of going to obtain wages in the United States. Natasha's poetic question was, did the Mexican state learn to ride the currents? Well, first of all, I'd like to say, I love this idea that that really what's being fought over here is not migration, but narrative of migration. Because I think that's exactly it, right? That really what the state is trying to do in all these kind of efforts is recapture, right, the narrative of migration through representational kind of policies. And I think that's a useful way of organizing this. I don't. So vis-a-vis Mexican migration, I think they're very much caught in the current. I think. You know, I didn't get to it in the presentation, but, you know, in chapters 5, 6 of the book, where we look at the 70s and 80s, right, you get a very real sense that there's this kind of this constant feedback loop between crisis and policymaking, like the Mexican state will only advance its policy making if there's a crisis, right? And so they're in no way looking to kind of like, or not able to get on top of this. It seems that they are reacting, and oftentimes it's in relationship to the severity of what is being reported in the United States. So if there's like a very severe case of migrant abuse, that's when the Mexican state, to your point, to recapture the narrative, will come forth, right, with the equally aggressive thing, right? So I recall in the book, there's this case of migrants who are, this case in Arizona, the Hannigan brothers case, where they bound migrants and they hoist them up by a tree and they burn the bottoms of their feet, and then they release them and then they shoot pellets at their back, right? And this becomes like a whole thing in Mexico, right? Because it's just a horrific case of abuse. And so this is when Mexico begins to kind of really dive deeper into what it calls colonization efforts, right? So it sends like its press corps to cover these newfound settlements that are being established by the Mexican state, right? One thing happens and the other thing happens. It's this constant kind of caught in the current kind of elements. But I would say vis-a-vis these more international migrations, I do think that the state is actually able to be to kind of sequester these populations and mobilize them in a way that it could not do with the Mexican migrants. I have to think about it more as to why, but they're certainly, the state is able to kind of use them more as kind of portable people, right, and relocate them. That may have to do with the fact that they come in with like less political rights. The Mexican migrants within Mexico are feel themselves as operating with a certain amount of power and citizenship that I think cuts against a lot of Mexican designs. But for example, with Guatemalan migrants in southern Mexico, part of the way in which the Mexican state learned to ride that current was by, in the 70s and 80s, forcibly removing a lot of those Guatemalan peasants to the Yucatan Peninsula, right, very far away, right? And so those are very concrete projects where they're very much not caught in the current. They're the ones kind of learning to commandeer that wave. And so I think in some ways they learn their most important migratory lessons, not so much from the Mexican migration, but from the migration of Central Americans in the late 70s and 80s. What did they miss? What did the U.S. miss? Well, interestingly, I think both governments actually, and this goes back to Christina's point about what makes policymaking in the U.S. different from Mexico. Again, for much of the 20th century, the U.S. has had a semi-functioning democracy, right? Which means that a lot of its immigration policies get, I won't say undercut, but layered with other layers of policymaking, especially at the state level, city level, right? This is why you end up having this huge kind of friction right between, the federal government and sanctuary cities, for example. That's not the case in Mexico, right? Policymaking is very much centralized, right? It's a very presidentialist system, right? Very vertical system, and so policymaking very much is the purview of like a few guys, right? And that's why when I was doing the research, I found fascinating that they would like even reference one another. So for example, in like during this 54 incident, there's references internally about, can somebody please speak to Diaz Ordaz because he wants to get violent with the migrants, right? Of course, Diaz Ordaz famously then goes on to like massacre students in the local massacre, right? But you can see like his penchant as an individual, right, is to say, forget all this discourse, right? Like let's whack him with a stick and get him to go back to their towns, right? So I would say in Mexico, right, at least from my archival research, right, it seems like that the state is so small, so vertical, and so direct, right? And so ultimately, I think what ends up happening is that they both miss the incredible tapestry of ideas that people had for reforming Mexican society, right? That's the thing I kept coming back to, I think, in the book, right? That was the hook for me, right? Is seeing that actually Mexicans from all across, like a wide cross section of society, had a bunch of ideas as to like what was actually ailing Mexico. So some people said it was the fact that we abandoned the ejido. Some people said is that the fact that we don't push the minimum wage enough. Everybody had their own little idea, their own sense of just how you could kind of moderately improve life in Mexico, right? And all of that gets kind of cut out, right? Because the system is so bent on just shaping the narrative and coming up with a good idea that it leaves actually the tapestry of good ideas by the wayside, right? Because it's not as sexy, let's say. And so I think that's ultimately what ends up happening. I mean, amongst those ideas, for example, are they even ignore ideas within their own government, right? So Governor Maldonado, who I showed you, who visited the migrants in 1954, he had an interesting idea of creating a shared labor pool, for example, in northern Mexico, right? He said, let's accept the fact that both the U.S. and Mexico, we both draw on this labor, right? So let's just be forthright about it, have this labor pool explicitly set out in northern Mexico, we both tap into it as needed, right? and I'm not saying I necessarily endorse that idea, but I'm saying like
Yeah.
there's at least there's a forthrightness about that that is preferable to the cynicism I think of both societies, right, where they kind of use migrant labor and then act like they don't, right. At least there you have like a very explicit policy proposal, right.
Yeah.
So all of that kind of gets cut out by the way these both governments work or don't work.
Well, thank you again. It's nearly 6:45, actually. Cristina.
I have to go teach.
Yes.
So I'm gonna do it, but please continue.
Irvin and Natasha will
Yeah.
stay here for the Q&A. We have 20 minutes or so. Questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Maya. I'm a visiting scholar here. Thank you so much. This is super fascinating. So, yeah, as everyone has already said, I think the intervention is really powerful, and it strikes me as a critique not only of the way we tell the political history of migration, but also of just of the social history of migration and the way that histories so often have this kind of teleological, almost like a hero's quest structure. And you point to all of these ways that migrants or would-be migrants like remain important actors within Mexico. So I'm curious if you can just speak to like what you see as kind of the implications for the field of migration studies for like, well, what would it mean to kind of tell social histories that take the people who stay as seriously as the people who go?
Yeah, I think that's, to me that appears to be like a frontier of understanding migration. And so I've had, grad students and undergrads like begin to kind of go in that direction. I very much approach this at the level of like national policy, but I think it'd be the next frontier of thinking about this is really at the level of local policy making, like specific, because it's not the case that like all of Mexico is disemboweled into the U.S., right? It's actually emerging from very concrete places in Mexico, like Jalisco, for example. And so, I can answer your question very specifically by like even thinking about some of my undergrad students who've done research on like the way in which in the 80s and 90s in Jalisco there was a big public scare, for example, around this idea that returning migrants brought back sexual STDs like syphilis, that they engaged in kind of promiscuity abroad. And so from the perspective of this very local, perspective in Jalisco, right, the problem is not any of these kind of issues of dignity and labor, right? It's a public health, right? That's what's coming back with the migrants, right? And so I think that's supremely consequential. Also, I think that moves us away from, I guess, my kind of book, which is really thinking about how the government, like the federal government, wields power, right? To think about actually, yes, there is this kind of authoritarian state, but nonetheless, power remains fragmented to a degree, right? So how do those kind of sub-federal levels of governance, right, really engage with the migration? So I'm happy to be the thing that they footnote and discard as being like too national, let's say. But yeah, hopefully that opens up the door in that direction. Thank you for your question.
Hey, Irvin.
Hey, Kevin.
Yeah, really cool presentation. I've been following your work, obviously, for a while. But I'm interested to learn, you talked a little bit about it right now with your answers, about like the southern border, right? Trying to see like, in a moment where Mexico sort of like roles reverse, right? Where they are now the receiver of Central Americans coming into their country, like, did you learn or see if like Mexico tried to apply what the U.S. was doing to regulate Mexican migration to Central Americans, and like if it worked or not, or was there some sort of collaboration with the United States and Mexico to regulate, the migration of Central Americans going north?
Yeah, so Central American migration to Mexico is very similar, and it really is attached to, I would phrase it for you in the sense that I think you can think about it as kind of continental wage ladder, right? Where like the Mexicans are moving into like the American Southwest, and the Guatemalans are moving into southern Mexico. And so there's a reality that really across the 20th century, we're really peaking around the 1950s. Central American migrants are really important for coffee cultivation, right, in Chiapas, right? And so the Mexican state actually does step in, and it does take cues from the Bracero program, and they do come up with basically what you would call like a Bracero program down there. And just as the Bracero program in the U.S. is iffy in terms of providing a convincing framework for securing labor rights, same thing happens in Mexico, right? Where there's even reports of migrants being enchained, right, to keep them in these plantations in southern Chiapas, right? So yes, they do take their cues and they do operate in that way. And I think it's only in the 70s and 80s where Mexico begins to get much more like autonomous policy and it's forced to get a little bit creative when it comes to Central American migration, because that migration shifts from being a kind of circular labor migration to being a more open-ended dislocation. A lot of the 70s, 80s migration comes as a result of civil wars, right? So the Mexican state is no longer able to apply that kind of labor lens to the migration, and is now forced to wrestle very concretely with the fact that these migrants are coming in, arguing that they are displaced refugees, right? And so this will prompt Mexico to kind of have to come up with some policy on migration. It actually doesn't really have a policy on for displaced peoples in the 80s. It's through the Guatemalan test case that they come up with some strategies, right? But it's very ad hoc, and ultimately it pivots around this idea of really trying to disappear the Guatemalans, right? Make them invisible, right? That's the kind of statecraft that they ultimately arrive to, right? This idea that the best way to govern migration is to make it as imperceptible as possible, right? That way it doesn't arouse animosities by anybody, and also to keep them, they're trying to keep them far away from the Guatemalan army that would often kind of raid refugee camps in southern Mexico. So yes, Guatemala is definitely like the important test case for Mexican governments. And so I'm glad both you and Natasha are aiming in that direction, because that's where I'm headed with my second project. So hopefully you're back here in 10 years, whenever, or 20, I don't know.
This is totally fascinating. I'm interested in the temporal framing of your book, so I get why you started in 1940. But what is it about 1980 that marks a good endpoint for the story you want to tell?
So that's from the 1980s, and thank you for the question. From the 1980s onward, Mexico really gives up on this idea that it's able to kind of move around people or bodies, right? It more settles on the idea that if it can keep if it can mitigate anything, it's the loss of money, right? And so it shifts into this idea of like, if we hold on to anything, let us hold on to the remittances, right? And again, it plays out in a very sloppy way. I almost laughed when I was reading like the internal report, or even public reports of how they were thinking about this in the 80s, where basically they say, yeah, we have no idea how many remittances are sent, the level of remittances, but we know it's a lot. And we know we would like to like capitalize on that, right? And so the Mexican state begins to like really latch onto remittances, right, as the vehicle for mitigating some of the effects of the migration, right? And so that's where I end with the 80s, because basically I argue that it's at that point that they're more or less, with the caught in the current thing, that's more or less when their body kind of goes tense and they kind of just like go with it, right? And so that's the post-80s endpoint. I suppose at some level, because I was born like in the 90s, I was like, I don't think I can narrate things that I was like alive. So I try to keep it historical.
Good reason as any.
Yeah.
My name is Pedro. I'm a first year at Gallatin.
Nice to meet you.
I was actually in history of the headlines last semester, and I was in your lecture.
Oh, yeah?
And I asked you a question about how narratives surrounding migration have sort of like shifted between, you know, border narratives like directly on the border and narratives that are in more rural areas. And you answered with the fact that the frontier is changing quite rapidly. I'm really interested in the phrasing that someone used, where power lies in the mobility of migrants, and sort of how you're challenging these shifting narratives. Is there a moment for you, or like, is there a before and after, where this like mobility of migrants going more north, I suppose, sort of like shifted the frontier or changed that frontier?
The frontier
of like sort of like migratory resistance, or that sort of idea of migration.
Yeah, I think I remember your question. It was about like sanctuary cities, was it? Like the way in which like Texas is kind of dropped, like its place in kind of national immigration discourse has kind of been reduced, and places like New York have maybe risen a little bit. So to say through your question, what was it? I don't want to answer it incorrectly.
Yeah, I was just sort of interested in how you said that power lies in the mobility of migrants, or rather how migrants believed that their power was in mobility in numbers. And I'm sort of interested also in how you challenge sort of like the very small scope of narratives surrounding migration, where, or I don't know, I guess I'm interested in like, is there a moment where the frontier changes from, you know, just the borderlands to now the rest of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know that it ever, it is always simultaneously local and national, right? I think that's the reality of immigration, right? Even when it's only kind of focused predominantly in certain areas of the United States, it nonetheless is a issue of like national concern, right? And so I would say that there's not necessarily before and after. I think that there's just, that's kind of a through line, I think, of immigration history, right? That the local is always national, I think, when it comes to any migration, whether it's Chinese migration, European migration. There's a way in which, even if it's just the Eastern Seaboard states that are concerned with European immigration, that becomes like a national debate and leads to national policy, right? So I do like periodizing things, but I do think it's one of those where like, yeah, I think the local, when it comes to immigration, often ends up kind of being blown up into kind of a national, maybe overblown into kind of a national concern. Adrian?
I have a two-part, so sorry.
I love those.
For the first one is I want to talk about remittances, right? So I just finished a book on remittances in like in the Philippine context. There's a temporal synchronicity that's really interesting to me, right? Which is like in like the mid-century moment, right? Like there's kind of anxieties, I think, in the Mexican state about both, number one, repatriation, but also using migration, mitigating migration through like internal settler colonialism, right? Whether that be homesteading or kind of like new ideas, like new pushes on like, you know, internal like Mexican boosterism, right? Like this is a thing in the southern Philippines as well, right? When that fails, when like when the management of migrant bodies fails, you get the management of migrant capital, right? Which is through remittances, either through ideas, through goods, right? In the Caribbean context, it's barrels being sent home, right? But also through finance capital. So my first question is, how does, you know, in both ways, right? Like you kind of have like this kind of agricultural imaginary about like the management of return migration and internal migration. How does that shift when the, like towards the end of your story, how does that shift towards the 1980s when the Mexican state prioritizes remittances? Namely, how does that change the way that they think about the impact of migration and remittances in terms of like local development, whether that's like urban development. I'm thinking about retirement homes also through return migration. That's a big thing in the global south, like trying to attract overseas migrants back home. Tourism is another big one, like kind of like repatriation as tourism is another one. So I wanna kind of hear it from the Mexican context. The second question is, I'm going to quote a thing that you say very often to me, and in like the context of our scholarship, which is the kind of U.S. immigration history that you both advocate for and also advance is an immigration history that looks at the U.S. from the outside in. And clearly, this is a book doing that, right? What do you have? So thinking about the kind of like aphorisms and tropology and shorthands that we have in U.S. immigration history, like the invisible hand, which is like the push and pull, right? After the publication of your book, what does the U.S. immigration history look like? Like, what does a fuller, more broader, transnational, kind of outside-looking in approach to U.S. immigration history look like? And namely one that I think in your case, right, by highlighting, you know, how fiat politics and kind of, you know, both U.S. and Mexican plenary power tend to kind of indiscriminately and very haphazardly try to manage migration, right? Like, there's challenges you're making to the strength and the kind of tenacity and the kind of legitimacy of nation states here. Right, by calling them, like your entire book is a diss track against the nation state, which I think is really dope. But yeah, long story short, right? Like, what is U.S. immigration history? What does teaching U.S. immigration history, articulating U.S. immigration history look like from the outside in, without relying on these kind of like nationalist liberal shorthands, right? Push and pull, etc.
Thank you for the great questions. And we should definitely do another event once we have the book out, and we can promote those as well.
It's delayed.
Oh, it's delayed?
Again.
Okay.
So,
all right, so I'll say with the question about remittances, again, it really ties in with the kind of the haphazard way in which the Mexican state does these things, right? Again, as I mentioned, they don't, initially in the 80s, they don't really have a good sense of the volume of remittances, right? In this moment, they just know it's a good idea, and they especially begin to think it's a good idea around 1985 because there's a massive peso devaluation crisis. So the peso goes from being worth, I think, 23 pesos to the dollar to being 350 pesos to the dollar. And so in this context, right, the Mexican state really kind of thinks it'd be a good idea, right, for it to encourage remittances, right, because that's becomes kind of a lifeline for a lot of migrant communities, right. So they think about it more at that level as providing kind of an immediate lifeline in the context of this kind of peso devaluation crisis. Once they begin to actually kind of formulate policies, part of what's fascinating to me is the way in which they stumble upon this idea of using remittances as a way of building up factories within Mexico. So they essentially have programs that support migrants using remittances to build up maquilas, but just within Mexico, right? Like not at the northern border. And so there's an attempt to kind of somehow spin, right, this foreign, well, not foreign capital, but capital coming from the migrants to create kind of these more self-sustaining economies internally. But again, oftentimes, what's interesting is that they don't lead only with the economics. There's always an attempt to phrase this in kind of very nationalistic terms, right? That somehow, by sending money back to your homeland, right, you are a better Mexican, right, and you're kind of retaining some kind of loyalty and some kind of binding kind of connectivity to the nation. Then in terms of the, what does immigration look like after my book? I mean, I'm deeply respectful of all, many of the immigration histories that have come before me, and I try to learn over the years to like add my little contribution, right? Because I sometimes I try to come in like as an asteroid, and you know, that can have a certain effect. But I think hopefully the effect that it has is that it shows that you can write a book without necessarily always coming back to the United States. Right? I think we live in a culture that is very navel gazing, and I don't refer even to like academia, just a popular culture, right? That is very navel gazing, right? It's always about how does immigration impact me, the American society, right? Or the economics, the cultural fabric, so on and so forth, right? And I tried really hard in this book, only to come to the United States when it popped up, right? I was like, I will send to Mexico, and I will send to these migrants, and the U.S. will pop up, as it always does, at some point here, right? And so for me, that was kind of like the methodological approach to the book, right? Is to kind of let the voices of the migrants and let the kind of policy making of the state lead, and then just have like the American state come in for like 2 sentences in a devastating way, midway through the book, right, to say, actually all that policy making was irrelevant, right, because it means nothing to America, right? And I think that's ultimately the kind of immigration history that I hope I am able to see, right, one in which the U.S. is not the center of the world, but precisely by leaving it to the side, you actually get a sense of just how consequential it is, right? Because you know these societies can have all these debates internally, and then they mean nothing, right? Because the U.S. decides, you know, it's their labor preoccupation that should guide things, right? So hopefully it helps, you know, a few folks carry out that methodology in other contexts. That'd be fascinating to see, because surely, just as I found a cacophony of voices, right, in Mexico, those same things probably exist in other places like the Philippines and, you know, Cuba, the DR. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? And so hopefully that's the kind of history that's seeded by this. So thank you for that question. I think it's a good, you know, way to end the discussion.
Well, Irvin, thank you. Natasha, thank you. Thank you all.